Hello and welcome back to Amplify. My name is Sanchi Singh, and this week I'm looking into green growth. The Indian economy showed signs of slowing down even before the double whammy of the pandemic and lockdown, which incidentally still hasn't ended 5 months in. Although the government has announced a generous $226 billion recovery and relief package, there are many concerns on how the ways in which we work and live and consume are going to change. How will the pandemic affect our behavior? What will our economic recovery look like? Will it be sustainable? Or will cabin fever have gotten the best of us scrambling to catch the next flight out? Perhaps we'll be too scared to venture out into public spaces and drive our demand further down into a slump. And what about the India-China brawl? What role will India play in the emerging geopolitical order given how severely mistrusted China currently is? All this and much more in today's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's episode on Amplify, where we are in conversation with Mihir Swaroop Sharma. He is an economist and a senior research fellow at Observer Research Foundation. He's a columnist at Bloomberg Opinion and Business Standard India, and he's the author of Restart, The Last Chance for the Indian Economy. And today we're going to be talking to him all about the state of Indian economy currently and what we can expect in the pandemic, post-pandemic, and further on. So thank you so much for being here, Mihir. I really appreciate it.
Well, I'm very happy to be here, Sanjay. Thank you for having me.
So, Mihir, let's just start off with what's been going on with the Indian economy even before the pandemic/lockdown hit us, right? So we've had the growing threat of NPAs, we've had the Yes Bank debacle. And so what does this tell us about the state of our economy?
I think the most important thing to remember here is that we had serious economic problems even before the pandemic, even before the lockdown. And that comes through very clearly in like the GDP numbers, for example. We got GDP growth in the quarter that ended in March. So January, February, and March of this year was only 4.2%. And remember, Sanchi, this was in fact before the lockdown really hit, because the national lockdown was 24th, 27th of March, thereabouts. 24th, right? And so you had about a week of the lockdown in this entire 3-month thing, which isn't enough to send it down that much, really. It was 4.2% in March, but the quarter before that, it wasn't a lot more. Okay. So the exact numbers have been 7% down to 6.2%, down to 5.6%, down to 4.4%, down to 3.1%. So there's been a slide in GDP growth for over a year prior to the lockdown. And you're right, that comes from many things. That comes from not just Yes Bank, but the broader crisis in non-banking financial institutions. Right. Which is that, all the fellows who would normally be lending people money for a new bike or a new house, they've run out of cash themselves. So individuals who would buy things on credit weren't buying them. And that just sort of expanded and had a ripple effect through the economy. So these are issues from before the pandemic. And the problem in many ways is that unless we address, for example, the problems in the financial sector that are not letting us get credit to the people who need it, we also will have trouble recovering from the effects of the pandemic and the lockdown, because those are exactly the mechanisms that you would need to restore growth.
Right. And it's an interesting point. I do remember actually the fateful day of March 24th. It was a week before my birthday. And I remember when the lockdown was announced, there was this huge scramble in front of the Kirana shops. And I mean, my family included, my mom and I just sort of raced to the shops to be like, oh my God, we have to sort of make sure that we've got all of our groceries in order. We've got supplies essentially for the lockdown, because there wasn't enough clarity as to when this will end. And so I'm just wondering then, how has the pandemic, the double whammy of the pandemic and the lockdown that just doesn't seem to end, then exacerbated the condition that our economy already was in?
The interesting thing here, Sanchi, is that some of the things that had worked really well for us as a country and as an economy coming, over the past 10 to 15 years are precisely those things that are making it more difficult for us to recover from the pandemic. One of those things is that we're a large country. And therefore, in large countries, you can build up internal supply chains that are really complicated. So part of something can be made in Haryana, another part of it can be made in Gujarat, and it can be assembled in Maharashtra. And that's pretty efficient, and it works well under normal circumstances. People can make money in lots of different places. When you have a pandemic, the issue is that suddenly these internal borders between states become even more relevant, and in India's case, even between districts, can become much more relevant than they were earlier. So, if your entire economy is structured around moving things across these internal borders, when those internal borders are shut down or become more controlled for public health reasons, your entire economy suffers for a lot longer than you would expect. And that's part of what we've seen. Amazon and Flipkart are just, which for a lot of your listeners will have been their immediate, your listeners are sitting at the edge of the supply chain and they're in touch with Amazon and Flipkart, and they recognize that Amazon and Flipkart aren't delivering as well as they should, right? Now, just imagine that that is the case across the economy for absolutely everyone.
Right.
That the things that they need to make stuff are not arriving, or are not arriving on time, or are mystifyingly held up, or you can't get in touch with the shipper, etc., etc. So even if you're ready to work, even if you have social distancing in your factory and you manage to get permission to open and you're in an area which doesn't have problems, if you're dependent on something that's coming from somewhere else, you're still not able to work at full productivity. And I think economically, that is the first and most obvious implication of the pandemic and lockdown.
Right. And you mentioned our GDP, which was already quite low before the lockdown began, before the pandemic hit us. And, there's already been so much chatter about what kind of recovery countries across the world are expecting. And there's hope that that recovery is the much coveted V-shaped recovery. But before we get to the recovery, I just wanted to ask, do you think that the GDP numbers and the fiscal deficit that's widening, should we accept these figures as part of the new normal?
Well, I think that no country can, the fiscal deficit will run this year. I don't know what it will be, but it'll probably be about, for the union government, it'll be about 6 to 7% of GDP perhaps. So double what it should be. I don't think that we can afford to expect that is the new normal going forward. It's been a crisis year. The government will have to spend more. The denominator of that number is the GDP itself, which will not have grown that much. So we do need in this year to accept there'll be a bit of what economists call slippage in this number. But going forward, again, the job has to be to bring it back to a sustainable level. So the government cannot borrow too much in a year, because then people start to lose confidence in it. And over time, we'll have to reduce the fiscal deficit number. The problem is that the effect of this year is not going to be felt in what is called the flow, not in the fiscal deficit for a particular year, but in the total amount of debt that we have in the economy. And so far, India has been very fortunate in that it has not had a very high debt to GDP ratio, which means that as compared to the size of our economy, we haven't taken on a lot of debt, which means that people are willing to lend us money quite easily. And when I say us, I don't mean just the government. I also mean they're willing to lend companies, and even willing to lend those non-bank financial corporations and then lend it on to you and I, right? So our interest rates are quite low, partly because we've never built up this giant debt pile that a lot of other developing countries have. The effect of this year and a couple of years before and after may be to take us out of a safe level of debt into an unsafe level of debt. And suddenly all the equations that you have change. All right, you're no longer such an attractive destination for investment. You have to beg a little for money and things like that. And it'll need us to reassess what kind of economy we are. That's point one. Point two, on GDP growth itself, should we accept a lower new normal there? I would love to say no. I would love to say that at some point, it's automatic. We can snap back up to, 8%. But it looks like there is no growth engine right now. And this is an issue beyond the pandemic. It is that we have just had a multi-year slowdown in investment in India. Companies are just not investing enough. Private individuals are just not saving and investing enough. And because of that, we'll have to probably give up this notion that we're a high growth country for some time, unless something happens to change that.
And do we also then give up the notion of the much coveted V-shaped recovery?
Yeah, I think that by and large, look, we're going to have I hate making predictions as such, but we're going to have a bit of a snapback depending on how deep it turns out this next quarter, April, May, June, was actually. So, just if you look out the window and compare the number of people that you see outside now versus the number who were around in April, May, or June, you'll see that there'll obviously be a strong recovery from that really low base that we reached in March and early April. But that won't take us up to either before the pandemic or what it was 2 years ago or 7 years ago. It's not going to take us up to that level. It's going to be a bit of a recovery, but it's still going to be a lower plateau. The Economist calls this the 90% economy, that while the pandemic is on, we'll have to put up with a 90% economy. But to be frank, in India, it may be more like 70%.
Right. It's interesting that earlier on you mentioned about Amazon, you mentioned about Flipkart, and essentially how there's been all of these stoppages and blocks within like domestic supply chains. And ever since the June 15th brawl, sort of just zooming out a little bit, ever since the June 15th brawl between India and China, there have been growing demands to become Atmanirbhar or self-reliant, to make in India, to decouple, etc. And what are your thoughts on how India has dealt with the issue?
Yes, well, that's a good segue, because one of the reasons that our supply chains have been so problematic in India has precisely been because we've sent out informal instructions. The union government has sent out informal instructions to the ports, for example, telling them not to delay shipments that are coming in from China, or to not let them get past at all. And for example, the Union Minister Nitin Gadkari has complained about this, saying that it's a bad thing to have done. And Gadkari is kind of right, because this is, it's nominally meant to hurt China or to be some kind of retaliatory economic blow. But the fact is that it's going to hurt us in India more. And that's just a product of the nature of the structural dependence that the Indian economy has on China. So, I mean, basically, China's exports to India are only about 3% of what they export in total, right? And so it's 3% of what they export in total, and what they export is under 15% of their GDP.
Right.
So for them, it's a tiny pinprick, even if India shuts down all of its imports from China. Whereas for India, first of all, our exports to China are a larger proportion of our total exports. They're almost double. They're near 6% of our total exports. So it's going to be a harder hit, double the size of a hit. And secondly, imports from China are 15% of our total imports. And what that means is that a lot of what we import is crucial, not easily substituted at short notice. And if you don't allow that to come in, or you make it more expensive, or you make it more, or put delays on it, then all the people who depend upon that 15% block of imports are not going to be fulfilling their contracts. They're going to lose money. The people down the chain from them are also going to lose money, lose contracts, and so on and so forth. So it will have a much more impactful and negative impact on the Indian economy than it would on China. And the fact is that if you want to become less dependent upon China, which is in the long term and as a strategic goal perfectly acceptable and something that we should be doing, the first step is to make ourselves more competitive here, to make sure that we can We can tease some supply chains away from dependence upon China, and we can maybe find other trade partners. We can substitute for what is manufactured in China, in India, by being better, not by keeping it out. And once you do that, then you have a sustainable way to take on Chinese influence in the economy. If you do something in the short run for a couple of, for basically to get the headlines, then it's going to actually hurt us more. And most of what the government has done in the past couple of months on the economic front has been like that.
Right. And you've talked about the impact that this will have in terms of what we export and in terms of what China exports to India. But China is also, I think China's cumulative investments in India exceed $8 billion, if I'm not mistaken. And how do you think, this method of economic retaliation that is currently being pursued, that is indeed a short-term outlook to this issue, how do you think that will affect China's investments in India?
Well, I think that we have to look at Chinese investments in India in three buckets. And one is the bucket of investment into critical infrastructure, right? And by critical infrastructure, I mean, if a Chinese company is making or running our electricity power grid, if it's making or running our telecom stuff, so the stuff that you and I are using to talk to each other, the cables on which it runs, the switches that it uses, that has been a major destination for Chinese investment in the past 15 years. That's something that maybe we need to learn to live without if we have accepted, as we appear that we have, that China is a major strategic rival of India's, because it means that no country that cannot depend upon another country should allow that country this kind of hold. And owning, managing, making, controlling our basic infrastructure is the kind of hold that maybe we don't want to give Beijing over us right now. That's one. The second bucket is a lot of Chinese money has come into the startup sector. And, I've forgotten the numbers exactly, but maybe it's 8 out of 10 Indian unicorns have Chinese investments, but we all know who they are, right? It's like Tencent has gone into one bunch of people, Alipay has gone into Paytm, etc., etc. And it's been very easy in recent years for the Indian startup economy, when Western capital basically dried up, because it looked at the returns that it was getting, of the exits it was getting in the startup economy here, and saying, look, that's not good enough for us. Then a lot of the startup people turned to China, and the money kept flowing. And that in many ways kept the startup bubble going for longer than it would have otherwise. And the only thing that I have to say here is, look, it was a bubble. It was going to break anyway. That money would not have gone in forever. And if it came in forever, in spite of there not being any apparent returns, then we should have been worried, because then that money was chasing something other than returns, and that's the problem, right? So that's bucket two. And I can understand why startups are upset, which they are, about these investment restrictions on China. But it's just pushing to today something that would have happened next year or the year after.
Right.
And the final bucket is money coming in from within, quotes, China, that may not be really Chinese at all. And that's if it comes in, for example, from Hong Kong. And there are lots of pools of capital that are meant to go into elsewhere in Asia that are aggregated in Hong Kong. So money coming in from Japan, from the US, from Australia. And there's a fund manager sitting in Hong Kong, and he's investing in various places, including India. Now, according to Indian rules recently, that may still count as Chinese money. And that's something we have to address, because we can't cut ourselves off from all forms of capital.
Right. And do you then foresee India playing a more prominent role in the emerging geopolitical order, given that we're already at loggerheads with China, and then, of course, everyone is conveniently blaming China for the pandemic and the virus itself? What sort of role do you think India can play in the emerging geopolitical order?
Well, I mean, this is a very important question. And Sanchi, as it happens, I have, I don't know what the etiquette about this is, but maybe let me plug a podcast that I've just started, and it's called Paperclip, and we look at sort of research that's coming out of the academic world and experts of various kinds on issues that are in the headlines. And the first 3 episodes of Paperclip are essentially about this, which is what kind of geopolitical role can India imagine for itself in the post-COVID world, given these additional tensions that we have now with Beijing. And it's very interesting because if you look at the economics, and we look briefly at the economics just now, there isn't a lot that we can do directly and immediately to tackle the China issue. If you look at it purely in terms of actual, hard physical power, in terms of defense capability, military capability, and so on, I mean, there's no nice way to put it, but we have not been spending as much money on our military as maybe we should have, and therefore, we've fallen further and further behind the Chinese in the past 15 to 20 years, and we're not really a player in the world at that point, in military terms. And the conclusion that I came to in the podcast is that essentially the only thing we have going for us is that essentially we have allies, or we have possible allies, right? So people don't dislike us as much as they dislike China right now. And if that's all we have, then that's what we have to use. So we have to step up, play a much more cooperative role with the rest of the world than we have been doing so far. We have to try and reduce tensions with the US. We have to try and reduce tensions with neighbors like Bangladesh, with Nepal, with Sri Lanka. We have to try and figure out a way in which to embed ourselves in the broader Asian ecosystem of ASEAN, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, and so on and so forth. If we manage to do that rather than looking inside, then we have a chance of dealing with this 10, 15, 20-year Beijing threat. If we don't, then we are geopolitically irrelevant, regardless of what we've been telling ourselves for some time now.
Right. And I like the way that you put it, that we sort of have to use the fact that we are at least not as disliked as China at the moment to our advantage. But I wonder then if that's true domestically, because there's just been so much that's going on the political front itself within these last couple of years, and perhaps even longer. And one of the trends that have come to the fore is the trend of sustainability, and people are talking more about India's carbon footprint and environmental policy making. And all over the world, governments are announcing packages to ensure that post-COVID recovery is a sustainable one. So, and India itself has announced a $226 billion package, if I'm not mistaken. And so what does India's green growth trajectory look like for you?
Okay, 2 things here. First point, I don't actually know how much money the government, 226 billion takes into account a lot of money that's actually not going to be spent, or money that has already been spent previously, or money that was being spent on other stuff, right? Yeah. So in terms of the actual size of our relief package and our recovery package, it's not very large. Maybe that's a good thing because we don't actually have that much money as compared to a lot of other places. But in terms of sustainability, the question we should be asking is, what's in there? And what's in this package that puts us on the kind of recovery path that will ensure that we have greener growth going forward? And the answer here is that, well, it's a little confused. And it's a little confused because it doesn't seem there's been very coherent thinking about sustainability and about the green trajectory of the Indian economy in New Delhi for some time. I'll give you an example of how it's confused, right? On the one hand, they have thought, not as part of the package, but in other stuff that they've been doing recently, to try and ensure that solar power producers in India do not suffer too much because of the pandemic and the lockdown. So the first instinct for a lot of state electricity providers was, oh my God, everybody's at home. I don't need to produce that much power if I'm, the Maharashtra State Electricity Board. So the first person that I'm going to cut out of my purchases is the local solar guy, right? And that had really put a lot of the solar producers under pressure. And the government in New Delhi has tried to ensure that that hasn't actually happened, that people haven't tried to cut the solar producers out. So you'd think that that shows that they're committed, right, to a green trajectory. But that's not all that they've done. In the opposite direction, as it were, one of the big things that they've been very proud of as a part of their recovery measure is opening up and increasing the amount of private sector coal mining in India. And they've produced enormous projections of how much more coal they'll be getting out of the ground. And obviously, that's not necessarily a good thing when it comes to thinking about a sustainable or green transition. So there's been a lot of confusion actually as to how we can go forward. My thinking on this is that at a moment of crisis like this, we really shouldn't even necessarily be hoping for a green stimulus, as it were. We're trying to ensure that it's not a brown one. So at least it leaves the possibility of a green transition open rather than locking us into older and less sustainable ways of growth in business.
Yeah, and I remember when the lockdown began and people were sort of looking and grappling around for silver linings, there was news of reduced air pollution, which is a huge problem in New Delhi. And we all know that the oil and airline industry is struggling as well during lockdown. And you mentioned coal mines. So one of the quickest ways to sort of boost an economy is to actually resort to these industries, to sort of pump up these industries, as it were. And do you then think that once the pandemic subsides or becomes a little bit more manageable, carbon emissions will bounce back to what they were pre-lockdown?
At least one major contributor to carbon emissions is not coming back that quickly, which is airline travel. So it's not like we're going to be, any one of us is going to be traveling as much until, vaccines are not only commonly available, but we can prove when crossing a border that we've had a vaccine and we've had the right vaccine. And that's a lot more that's a lot more complicated than you think it would be. It's like having another passport system and one that's never existed before.
Oh God, yeah. That imagery just makes me sad.
Yeah. So it's going to be a lot tougher even after there's a vaccine. But on the other hand, we may not be traveling that much, but when we travel, we're all going to want to leave more space between us. So we're not going to be packed in like sardines into economy class anymore. So there's going to be a lot of empty space deals. There's going to be a lot of you're the only person in your row deals. So we don't know what airline travel, for example, will look like after this or for the next couple of years going forward. It may be that many fewer people travel, but we still have approximately the same amount of emissions because the amount of emissions per traveler has jumped so much, right? So this is such an unprecedented thing to have happened that we can't really predict what the impact will be on emissions when we reach, as I said, what the economists call the 90% economy. When we reach a sort of steady state, a stable state, even before we have effects of the pandemic have fully gone away, we still don't know the emissions impact.
I can just imagine if we were to actually go on to flights once this pandemic is subsided, just sort of frantically looking around for a stray cough, just all wrapped up in PPE. I think it just sort of takes the fun and the anticipation out of travel as well.
Well, Suchi, I have to say that I came back to Delhi on, I think it was the 13th or 14th of March from London, where I'd been for some time. And this was, I think, about 4 or 5 days before air travel was suspended. And I was already sort of in a vague sense of panic, right, about it. And I could not relax on the flight because the moment somebody coughed, anyone in the entire, flight, I would turn around and sort of stare at them, which is probably not a good idea, but it was really difficult. And to my left, across the aisle, there was a family, a Chinese family, returning from Britain to China. And they had, because I think China was way ahead on the curve on this, because they'd already had it for some time, that family had shown us what the future of travel was like because they were in head-to-toe PPE. and they didn't go to the bathroom once on the flight. It was tough. They looked uncomfortable, and I think that's for a lot of people, particularly a lot of vulnerable people, that's going to be how you travel going forward.
Yeah, I remember having a conversation with my friends because, for the listeners, in India, like the theaters, the cinemas, everything is shut. All public spaces where you can potentially gather and spread the virus, everything's shut. And you know how when you go in for a movie, they have this long, winded advert about the effects of smoking on public health. And we were just joking that, my friends and I were just saying that next time, whenever theaters open, when we're in there and someone coughs, we will hope against all odds that it's Manoj and not the guy next to you.
yeah, that's right.
So it's actually quite, it's a very turbulent and weird time that we're living in. But to go back to our conversation, you talked about how electricity usage patterns have shifted. And I think there's been a change in consumption overall during lockdown when non-essential purchases have ceased. So could demand side solutions here drive or consolidate behavioral change that could in turn promote sustainable development?
Yes, well, this is a lot of what we've been hoping, that maybe there will be changes to how people live and consume because they've been shown a different way to do that by their experiences in this period. Maybe people will be, for example, offices might recognize that they can get a reasonable productivity out of people who are working from home, and then there'll be less demand for commuting, right? And if there's less demand for commuting, hopefully in the long term, you'll have fewer cars on the road, et cetera, et cetera. But these demand side behavioral changes can also work in the other way. And we have to be very careful about that, which is that people may develop a phobia for crowds. And people may not want to go into public transport. And so, efforts to maybe increase the number of metro lines as opposed to car highways in India and elsewhere will face resistance because people will say no. Suppose there's another pandemic, I want a car. I don't want to depend upon something the government can shut down, like the metro. So, we have to accept again that behavioral changes because of something like this cannot be assumed to be positive for us. We can try and nudge people in the right direction, right? So we can nudge them to maintain those behavioral changes that we like and avoid those ones that we don't like. So we can nudge them by saying that working from home or companies that allow people from work from home will receive a rebate of X amount upon some taxes that they pay, or will not have to contribute a certain amount of their PF, et cetera, right? So you can come up with mechanisms to incentivize companies to keep people at home. And you can also incentivize ways to push people into public transport, even if they don't want to do it. But we have to be aware that there will be behavioral changes, and not all those behavioral changes will be positive and things that we're happy about.
And I wonder then, what is possibility of a Green New Deal in India? I know that this is a concept that's talked about so much in the US, in the UK, and people are arguing for the various benefits something like this can have. But can India have a Green New Deal? And obviously it cannot be an import from the US and the UK. So what would it look like for India if we were to have one?
So Sanchi, you have asked me about one of my little hobby horses, right? Which is that I hate the phrase Green New Deal, and I hate it because I think it's a con, right? And it's a con because, frankly, we care about investment, we care about sustainability, and we care about jobs, prosperity. And unfortunately, we must accept that sometimes these two things don't work in the same direction, right? The New Deal, the original New Deal that the phrase Green New Deal is based on, worked because there was a single point agenda to get the economy recovering again. And therefore, you could come up with interventions that satisfied that one point agenda, and they worked. If you want to both create a more sustainable economy and create jobs. The problem is that a lot of what you want to do may go in opposite directions. And unless we accept that and figure out how we're going to manage the trade offs, how we're going to compensate the losers, we will never get any kind of Green New Deal, right? And the reason we don't have a Green New Deal in either the US or the UK is precisely because the people who've been pushing for it have not tried to figure out exactly how to compensate those who will be losers. And that has to be part of the job that we have to do here. One of the big insights of economics is that if you try and solve more than one problem with any one policy, then you're not going to be able to choose the best policy. It's called a second best solution, and sometimes it's not even second best, right? If you want a first best solution, you have to define your target for your policy properly. And the Green New Deal does not do that. And that's part of the reason why it doesn't work in India, or we haven't even heard the discourse about it that much in India, is because people in India are very aware of the trade-offs between growth and almost any other kind of thing that we want. We're aware of the trade-offs between, maybe trying to spend resources on growth and environmental protection. We're aware of the trade-offs between resources on growth and healthcare, putting money into healthcare. This is how, this is something that goes at the heart of how policy is made in India. And the issue that we have when we design a sustainable recovery going forward is that we have to figure out how it is that we can have these two sets of priorities, accept their differing priorities, but make a trade-off in an open and transparent way. So we can go to someone and say, yes, I know it's good for you and it's good for jobs in your district and it's good for cheap electricity maybe if we get more coal out of the ground. But that'll be bad for our aims and our green transition in the long run, so we can't do it. If we don't get that much more coal out of the ground, what else is it that we can give you to compensate for that? And we have to do that openly and transparently and as part of this deal, as it were. And unless we do that, we won't have a sustainable recovery, and we probably won't be able to achieve either growth or a green transition. End of rant.
I mean, that's interesting, but because isn't there research and policy papers that sort of suggest that there is going to be a far bigger economic impact of, climate change, which is the huge, broad umbrella term, on people's livelihoods and the way in which they work? I mean, if you look at India itself, the reason why we are pushing for, the solar industry and the renewable resource industry, renewable energy industry, so to speak, is because it is slated that they will have more jobs. So what do you have to say to that?
I think that, there are two things here. The first is that we in economics know, because of the way that people have responded to, for example, freer trade, that you can understand that there is something that helps everybody in the long run, but it really hurts some people in the short to medium run. And unless you manage to figure out how to deal with those negative changes in advance and while they're happening, you'll discover that the overall benefits don't, become politically impossible to provide. So in trade, what happened was essentially everybody benefited from more open trade, but some people lost their jobs. And those people who lost their jobs were just so pissed and, so politically active that we've across the world seen a retreat from freer trade. And my concern is that we have to make sure we don't do the same thing with the green transition, which is that, yes, in the long term, climate change is going to hurt us all, and it's going to hurt us badly. It's going to cost us a lot of money. It's going to take a lot of lives. It's going to make normal human development very difficult. But in the short to medium run, just like with trade, there are people who are going to be upset. Coal India may lose jobs, right? Those people will not be able to necessarily find other jobs in, for example, solar plants. We will have to accept that the battle against climate change means that, for example, milk may become more expensive, all right, because milk products become more expensive because we want to ensure that livestock herding is sustainable. Simultaneously, we're going to say that cars, right? Petrol is got to stay at maybe this higher, the higher level of carbon taxes that we have in India, right? And they'll just have to keep on increasing as time goes by. So these are ways in which individual people are hurt by things that we are committed to because of climate change, and we have to recognize that there will be this pushback if we make those changes. And we have to figure out a way to compensate them. Otherwise, you get a situation like in France, which we just saw, where in order to meet their own Paris targets, President Macron increased taxes on fuel, and you had an explosion of anger across the country, right? We just need to be aware that these are political issues that are deep, and our only way to get actual positive, sustainable change for the long run that makes sense and is implementable is to make sure that we take care politically and economically of those people and interests that will also lose out as part of the green transition.
Does the key then, do you think, lie in entrepreneurship? Because if it is such a fine line to walk between the political and economic aspects of it, do you think then it's up to people and their innovative selves and how entrepreneurial they are that they can then sort of drive this sustainable growth?
I mean, the fact here is that everything is up to us in the end, because I don't think governments, and our government in particular, is able to help here. And the problem with development and growth and talking about policy in India has always been that you can, make out a list of things that we really helpful and really supportive that the government can do or should do. And then you take it to the government, and the government will say, with the best will in the world, will say, okay, I can maybe do one of these 10 because I don't have either the money or the capability to do any of the other 9. Right? And at the end of it, you're always left with the feeling that what we have going for us in India is is Indians. It is the creativity that we have traditionally brought to a lot of very difficult problems. And if we manage to empower Indians and give them the minimum of resources and maybe point them in the right direction, point their energies in the right direction, then yes, we may be able to find solutions. But those 3 things also are the minimum that a government will have to do, which is empower entrepreneurs, empower creative people, give them the minimum of resources, which is, I guess, basic healthcare, basic education, etc., and point them in the right direction. So they're not, so they're focused on building stuff that helps India's future and not maybe on tearing each other down.
And on the topic of India's future, I think it would be a good idea to talk about India's future post-pandemic, because there are job losses, there's a looming recession, there's a pandemic that hasn't yet shown signs of tapering off. So how is that going to affect the way in which we work going forward?
I think, what do you think our workplaces will look like in India? Or
yes.
Well, I wish I knew, and I wish we had a sense of not just what our workplaces will look like, but whether we know if Indians that have gone home, and by gone home I mean, for example, migrant workers in cities that have packed up and gone back to their states of origin, whether they're willing to come back, and if they're willing to come back, under what conditions they'd come back. And the fact is that after an experience like this, a lot of people who've gone back home will just tell themselves that I don't want to risk that again. That was awful, right? And I didn't feel at home in the place that I went. I felt abandoned. I felt very cut off from any form of capability or resource. And I had a nightmare getting back to a place where people would help me. And one of the engines of Indian growth and the Indian future has always been this internal migration, people packing up, as I have, and maybe you or your parents have, packed up and left the places where their ancestors grew up and moved to another part of the country to try and do a little better. And if that engine doesn't work at full throttle, then we're going to be facing a very difficult growth situation going forward. And we're going to be facing, among other things, a very much more divided country and politically and economically.
Yeah. And do you think we are experiencing some sort of a deglobalization?
Well, we could have a bit of deglobalization, but again, we have an opportunity to not have deglobalization, but I mean, something I mentioned again in my podcast, reglobalization, right? Which is that things have gone wrong in the way that globalization has happened in the past 20 years. And if I want to be blunt about it, so too much of the value that globalization has created has flowed exclusively to China, right? And partly because the Chinese government has taken advantage of trading rules and investment rules to ensure it works like that. But if we have a reglobalization in which is more equitable, more fair, in which other developing countries maybe get a better shot at development and growth, then yes, I think that's the ideal thing that would happen. That could and should happen rather than deglobalization. There are tendencies towards deglobalization. People are skeptical. People are pessimistic. People are putting up barriers, and our country is one of those that is doing it. But I hope that people realize it hurts us more than it helps us. It definitely hurts India more than it helps us.
And do you think then that there are any silver linings, just to end this episode on a positive and optimistic note potentially? Do you think there are
This
any
is how
linings?
everyone who speaks to me, Sanchi, winds up saying, "Can you please say something positive? Where's your positivity? Please leave me something to
Yes,
hold on
just
to."
give us tips on how to save money, if nothing else. Give us
What? You're not already saving money, staying at home, not going out, spending money on overpriced popcorn and movie theaters?
I feel like Swiggy and all are really taking my money. So maybe if you can even give us a discount code in your name, that would be super beneficial.
I have to admit that now that Swiggy is working at full capacity, I have also been overspending there. But there are many things that could basically, let's really focus on what might be positive behavioral changes. People might learn how to queue in India. Just imagine the extraordinary change to our quality of life in this country. I mean, now you go to even relatively crowded markets, and there's always somebody who says, "No, stand in a queue. Don't shove."
Yes.
That's wonderful, isn't that a positive change? Imagine earlier we were a country that had never heard of queuing, and now we do. So that's a positive change. And let's look out. There may be other stuff of this kind.
Yeah. I mean, I actually remember this one time, and incidentally, it was at a visa office. It was at VFS, and I had to get a document photocopied, and I was standing, and there was no queue, but I was first in the queue. And there was like this slight, this swarm of people behind me just pushing me into the photocopier machine. And I was like, "Excuse me, do you mind? Can you please queue?" And they're like, "Please, can you just shut up?" That they would just climb on top of me and get to the photocopier machine themselves.
See, that's the interesting thing about India. Really, is that even when we break these norms, we do it with an air of like extraordinary self-righteousness. Like, who is this idiot following the rules? Or this idiot who's following the rules is screwing it up for the rest of us.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they were just very close to telling me, like, because you want to queue, you do not deserve to get your documents photocopied.
So hopefully some of this will change, and hopefully we will start taking healthcare as a government responsibility seriously, and this is not a small thing. If you look at surveys of Indians, you'll discover that overwhelmingly, as compared to other countries, most other countries in the world, we believe our healthcare is primarily a matter for ourselves and for our families. And it's not something for the broader community or the government to be concerned about. We're libertarians where, we're when it comes to healthcare. And it's quite extraordinary that we don't see a role for the government in it, in spite of complaining about public hospitals all the time. And so we never vote for people. I mean, no politician has ever gone up in any Indian election and said that I'm going to, improve the healthcare sector, right? And it's not because we're a poor country. At our level of per capita income, Thailand introduced universal healthcare, universal government provided healthcare. So it's not impossible. And it just requires us to change the way that we as voters and as citizens think about healthcare. And maybe this will do it.
Right. Mihir, it has been such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for taking time out. I've had a blast speaking to you. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you. And check out Paperclip from Mihir.
Yes, plug away. I have no qualms whatsoever. Plug away.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Of this week's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. You can find all the relevant links and handles to know more about our guest this week in the episode description. If you have any feedback, suggestions, requests, or simply just want to get in touch with us, then please do head over to our podcast website. We are available to flag and say hi to via Facebook, Instagram, or email. Thank you and see you next week.